Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Real wrath of God type stuff. Exactly. Fire and brimstone.
Hello, this is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
And joining us today will be John Dickson. And in today's interview, we're really honored to have John Dickson with us. He's the author of a book called Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history. And so he's going to be joining us to talk about that book. But he's written a whole lot of books. We'll talk a little bit about his background and stuff in a minute. But let's just talk a moment about the book and why we are doing an interview about a book.
Yeah, so this book is one that I had heard about off and on through different podcasts that I hear and different thinkers and authors. And I got a copy of it through the mail last year, and it kind of sat on my shelf because I was reading other things to get ready for the podcast. And so I was excited when we were able to set something up with Dickson and picked up the book and started reading it and couldn't put it down. And I love the approach that he takes as far as being open and honest about the pluses and minuses, if you will, of Christian history. His writing, I find, is easy to read, but at the same time, very challenging. And I was really shocked at some of the things that he uncovered, particularly about the Dark Ages, some things about Constantine, and how are we to understand things like the Crusades and the Inquisition. And of course, there is a overarching theme in the book about a composition that Jesus initially played and that Christians have been trying to play it ever since. And we'll get more into that. But anyway, such a well-written book. And it's one of the books that we've read and used to prepare for a podcast that I would definitely say everybody should have on their shelf. What did you think of it?
Yeah, I liked it a lot because, sometimes I've heard, if you remember back where Christopher Hitchens was on like his debate tour, God's this big old bully and look how religion poisons everything. And he would go on these big diatribes about all the evils of Christianity and religion generally. And the common sort of apologetics response, think of like Dinesh D'Souza and all the different people who were debating him at the time.
Sure.
He wrote a book that's still great about Christianity. And you sometimes see the response to critiques of religion being like, no, it's really good. Christians did all these things like make hospitals and look, we made this great thing and look, art and culture and education. And we wouldn't have universities if it weren't for Christians. But this book is like, let's just put everything back together. Let's not play everything's bad, everything's good. It's like, here, it's a whole big mix. And, we've got dark chapters and we got bright chapters. And we're going to look and see what happened and sort of divide out the myth from the truth and, try to draw out a true picture historically of the good and the bad of the Christian church. So I like it because he's really trying to get at a sort of a frank examination of Christian history. If we want to sort of blurbify the book, we could say, we're looking at the dark chapters of the Crusades and the Inquisition, and then moments of virtue and compassion. He's showing Christianity's place in civilization for anything from the Sermon on the Mount to the present, and uncovering the role of the church in imitating the teachings and life of Jesus. So I think it's got a great apologetic value because just knowing the history will allow someone to respond better to critiques of Christianity with honesty, with, compassion, not trying to cover up past things like, but saying, no, here's how it really was.
Yeah, and just to kind of put a bookend on that, I also think that one of the things I like, and this is kind of alluding to what you're saying, is that he's willing to own certain things in Christian history, but also to give a fuller picture. Because sometimes, unfortunately, when we heard it from the likes of Harris and Dawkins and Hitchens and things like that, it was always, how can we use this to make Christianity look as poor as possible, right? Or as bad as possible. And so he's willing to say, okay, yeah, there's some truth to what Hitchens said here, but that's not the full story. And so I think it gives us a broader context in which to understand some of these events. And I also think readers will find that when it comes to things like the Dark Ages, for example, that they'll be very shocked to learn that the Dark Ages aren't exactly what we've always been told they are. And so, again, definitely worth picking up. But yeah, let's talk about John Dickson.
Well, he's a multi-talented individual who began his career as a professional singer-songwriter. But he's also delved into various fields, including being an author, he's a speaker, a historian, and he's a media presenter. He's widely recognized as the founding director of the Center for Public Christianity, where he served from 2007 to 2017. He's got a real impressive collection of published works, totaling over 20 books. 2 of these books were even adapted into television documentaries. And his latest release, For the Love of God, How the Church is Better and Worse Than You Ever Imagined, premiered in Australian cinemas in June 2018. So throughout his career, John has held teaching and research positions in esteemed institutions such as Macquarie University, Sydney University, Ridley College, Melbourne, and the University of Oxford. And he currently resides in Wheaton, Illinois, and he has a very busy public speaking schedule. It was hard to arrange this interview. So he's also got a great podcast called Undeceptions, and you can find out more about that at www.undeceptions.com, like you're undeceiving yourself. So it's good stuff, and also johndickson.org. Find it in the show notes, as always, and let's get ready for the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, there's John Dickson coming into the studio right now. Hey, John, how are you?
Hey, Brian, Chad, good to chat with you.
Yeah, we just had to get Joe Rogan out of the way here. So, well, John Dickson, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself. People are going to notice your Australian accent, but you're in the States. They're going to need a little bit of context. So, would you introduce yourself?
Okay, well, I am now at Wheaton College in Illinois, where I was offered a chair that would allow me to use it as a platform to make Christ public, but also train the next generation of leaders in how to reach a rapidly changing America. And I think the logic of the invitation that I come do that was that I've spent 25 years trying to reach the quintessential post-Christian nation, which is Australia, and doing that through media and books and academia and so on, and having a great time trying to work out how do you engage a nation that has put Christianity well and truly in the rear view mirror and has set about sort of retelling the story of our good culture that excludes Christianity entirely. So that's what happens in post-Christian cultures. It's not just that Christianity is criticized, it's that people actually rewrite the story, that all of the good things of our Western humanitarian culture came from us in the Enlightenment. They don't come from Christianity. So I've been trying to reach out to that kind of culture for 25 years, as I say, coming to the US once or twice a year for at least 20 years. And so to get the invitation from Wheaton to take up this position was both surprising, daunting, but in the end, we felt compelled to come here, which we did 14 months ago, and we're loving it.
Wow, that's a big move. I mean,
Yeah.
And has it been a real culture shock, or do you feel like you're fitting in?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about America is we're so similar, and that is deceptive because you think, it's just like Australia. But in fact, there are things that are very different. And, politics is one of them, just how divided and hot politics are in this country.
Really? I haven't noticed that.
Yeah, well, so we've really struggled to find a good, sensible TV news at the end of the day. I mean, a classic Australian gets home from work and watches the 7 p.m. national news. Half an hour, you get a little bit of international, little bit of national, little bit of local. And it's not too crazy left or crazy right. And it's great.
Yeah.
I have gone all over the TV stations of America and haven't done so well finding an account, a news program that doesn't think half the country are idiots. In terms of culture shock, that's been a big one.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, interesting.
Well, if you find that objective news outlet, please let us know so we can send it out to our listeners. Because
what's most worrying is I've asked really thoughtful Americans, what's the TV station to watch at the end of the day to get world news, local news? And they have all said, oh, no, we don't have one. Just watch BBC.
Wow. Wow.
That's
wow.
unpatriotic.
That's yes, indeed. Indeed. Super interesting.
So I refuse. I'm still on my journey to find the TV station.
There's no such thing.
Yes. We'll keep searching. We'll keep searching.
Well, we have found an objective look at the events in Christian history.
Indeed.
And it's in this book you've written as we transition to this book. Tell us a little bit about the book Bullies and Saints, why you wrote it. I know you've done historical work and things like that. This was just right up your alley, I suppose, but what's the goal and motivation behind writing it?
It's always hard to self-analyze, right? You know, why you did X versus Y. But I think it's partly personal therapy. You know, because as a trained historian, I know where the bodies are buried in Christian history. There's a lot of bodies buried. The cemetery of Christian history is very large. And so I wanted to puzzle through the obvious questions that throws up. I also want to engage in as fair a way as I possibly can with the claim that you increasingly hear that Christianity has only raped and pillaged its way through history. And in 2017, there was an Ipsos poll of 20 nations asking, do you think religion has done more harm than good? And Australia came in at second, as in the second greatest number of people think religion has in fact done more harm than good. 63% of Australians agreed religion's done more harm than good. The only nation to beat it was Belgium. Belgium was 67%. Now, America's down at 39%. So a minority thinks we'd be better off without religion, that religion's done more harm than good. But it's that feeling out there, and I know Americans can feel it growing, this sense that secular culture thinks religion is not self-righteous and holy and too good, but that it's evil and violent and abusive and bigoted. So I wanted to confront that in a way that, you know, wasn't knee-jerk. You know, I didn't want to write the book that just showed you how awesome Christianity is and we've not done any bad things. But nor do I want to join the chorus of critics of the church, which is, you know, very cool. And as a Christian, you can often get points from the secular media by criticizing your own kind,
It's a good
slamming the church, you know, and you find a lot of Christians rush to this. I was very conscious of all of that. And I wanted to write something that you could put in the hand of a genuine professor of ancient history in a secular university, and they would recognize it, first of all, as a work of history. I wanted something that would correct a kind of Christian triumphalism, that we've only done good things. And, you know, those Crusades, that's not us, that's the naughty Catholics. I wanted to bring a sort of correction to that, but I also wanted to bring a correction to those who think Christianity's just harmed the world, when in fact, Christianity has given us some of the things our secular humanitarian culture loves most.
Yeah. I was thinking about that as you were answering that question. I'm curious as to, being a Christian historian as you are, and you come to this topic, a lot of times people also often want to bring out the objection of, well, you know, he's a Christian, so therefore he's biased. But one of the things I was so impressed about as I read through your book was your ability to be objective. You were willing to own the errors and the mistakes, but then you were also willing to say, but hey, there's more to the story, or don't forget about the good that's been done or whatnot. And so as a historian, when you come to topics such as the Crusades or the Inquisition or some of the various topics you hit on in the book, how do you keep your own biases in check? What are some ways that you work to do that?
Part of the answer is just my background. So my doctorate was in ancient history in a secular, big state secular university. So professionally, academically, I've had to engage with the secular outlook. And I taught at Macquarie University and Sydney University, two big state universities. Both would be described as sort of progressive universities. And so having taught for 20 years in those kinds of institutions, I think I have developed enough of a sense of the importance of objectivity and the tools to come to that. So that's one answer.
Okay.
The other answer is a kind of theological one, actually. I, all the way through the writing of this book, had the Lord's words in my ear. Look at the log in your own eye. Take it out, and then you'll see clearly the speck in your neighbor's eye. And that was said to disciples. That wasn't said to the Pharisees or someone else. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. And so in the actual teaching of Jesus is what I call in the book the ultimate self-corrective mechanism that should always, as a disciple, be wondering, what is the log in my eye? There's bound to be one. And if I'm honest with you, my sort of takeaway from having done all the research and then writing up this book, my takeaway is not, oh, wow, how could that Christian mob have murdered Hypatia, the great 5th century philosopher? Or how could the Crusaders have done that? Although I am shocked, actually my main takeaway is, I wonder what my blind spot is. I wonder what the log in my eye is, that prevents me from seeing clearly.
That's challenging.
So it's that theological thing that drove my willingness to accept that Christians have done terrible things when there's evidence. Now, when there is not evidence, like the classic claim that Christians destroyed the great library of Alexandria. Well, there's no evidence of that. So I didn't include that in the book. So where there is not evidence, I'll point that out. But where there is, I've got Jesus in my ear saying, there's a log.
That's really cool. One of the things that you write in the book, and I love this, it was one of the things that attracted me to the book because I had heard people like Frank Turek, for example, use it, is you write this. You say, Jesus Christ wrote a beautiful composition. Christians have not performed consistently well. Sometimes they were badly out of tune, but the problem with a hateful Christian is not their Christianity, but their departure from it. I was wondering if you can provide our listeners with a bit of background and kind of explain to them what in the world Christian history has to do with a cello and Bach.
Well, musicians in the audience will know that the cello suites, and in particular the prelude to the cello suites, Bach's cello suites, is widely regarded as one of the most sublime, mathematically perfect pieces of music ever written. I mean, the way he has composed it is just extraordinary. I've listened to this for 30 years, and I'm still amazed at it and still moved by it every time I hear it. And I think of the gospel, the life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus as the ultimate cello suite, as the ultimate beautiful melody given to our world. No melody has ever matched it. And at the heart of that melody is the teaching, love your enemy, do good to those who hate you, which for Jesus isn't an arbitrary ethic. It is actually the whole arc of his life, according to the Gospels, loving the enemy, giving his life on a cross for enemies. So this ethic of love of the enemy is actually the ethic that is the immediate reflection of the gospel of salvation. So for me, that's the beautiful melody. And it has transformed audiences, to carry on the metaphor a little bit, in every single century. And it has been played in every single century. I'm not one of these good Protestants who thinks after Augustine, the whole thing's gone to hell until 1517, when Martin Luther, went public. There's a lot. This melody has been played in every century.
Agreed.
However, Christians have sometimes played that really out of tune. And you only have to think of the anti-Semitic laws that Constantine the Great built into Roman law that then became European law, that sidelined Jews at law. Well, that's a departure from the tune. Or I mentioned the murder of Hypatia in 415 in Alexandria. That was Christians who did that. We even have names. It was the bloke. Sorry, I shouldn't say bloke. speaking to Americans. The person, the man.
Works for me.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
I was good with bloke.
The bloke who killed her, who led the mob to kill her, was Peter the Reader. His gig every Sunday was to read the scriptures to the congregation in Alexandria. Well, he led the mob to kill this woman philosopher, Hypatia, whom everyone loved, who had actually taught many of the Christian leaders of that period, but because of politics and jealousies, she was killed. So this is clearly a departure from the tune. But what I find so wonderful, even about a story like the tragic killing of Hypatia, is we know about this event because our best source was written by a Christian leader utterly outraged that Peter the Reader and other Christians in Alexandria had done that. So right in this very incident, you have the worst of Christianity, the Christianity played out of tune, and then you've got this other Christian source saying, this is despicable, this is worse than non-Christians, but it's a Christian source. And right there you see this self-corrective mechanism, this spotting the log in our eye. And the arc of the whole book is there is a beautiful melody. And Christians have sometimes played it well, sometimes poorly, but the melody is there in every century. And when Christians hear it again and are drawn back to it, wonderful things happen in our world.
Yeah, I find that so helpful, and I've gotten I want to thank you for it because I've gotten so much mileage with it in conversations with people who bring up some of the things that challenge them, and it's just a great way to point them back to Jesus and say, if you're going to accept or reject Christianity, let's do it based upon, like you said, his tune or his melody.
Yeah,
and
our friends who don't believe, they know what Jesus stood for, even in vague terms. Like, and so it's almost like the criticism of the church is borrowing Jesus' melody, because that's the melody by which we're judging the church.
Right.
You know, it's our friends who aren't Christians, who are critics of the church, are actually using the ethic of love and humility and compassion to criticize the church. Good on them. Go for it. But in doing so, they are actually vindicating the melody, the beautiful melody.
Yeah, you can't call someone a hypocrite unless you know what standard they're breaking.
Yeah. And as sure as anything, we didn't get that ethic of love and humility from Rome or Greece or Egypt or Babylon or Saxons or Gauls or Celts.
For sure.
You know, it came from one place. It came from the Jewish Christian environment that reshaped the Western world.
That's good.
I wanted to find out, because you're more familiar with Christian history, and so maybe for you this was like going back through and just sort of like, okay, how can I talk about this? And for a lot of people, this might be new information in this topic, new information in this topic. Maybe they've never delved into Christian history. But as you were writing the book, I'm wondering if there were certain aspects that had come to light for you that you weren't aware of before, that maybe surprised you, or oh, wow, what an interesting revelation here.
How many do you want?
Have at it.
You stop me when you want. I mean, a couple of realizations. One, I don't think I'd ever realized just how confident the earliest Christians were when they were being criticized and ridiculed and killed for the faith. So we know of 5 or 6 certain periods of persecution of the church in the first 300 years. And I think I had always imagined, Nietzsche's critique, that was Christians were all from the slave class, so they were like beaten down dogs. So of course they were going to be humble. You know, that if you kick a dog long enough, it thinks submissiveness is the norm. And that's what Nietzsche said explains early Christianity. But actually, when I've read and studied the sources of the first 3 centuries, the thing that is amazing to me is they thought they'd already won. The reason they felt they could be so humble is because they knew Jesus had been raised to life, sitting at the right hand of God, was coming to judge the world. So they could love the Roman governor that was trying to kill them, say Tertullian writing a letter to Governor Scapula in 215 in Carthage. And Tertullian can say, oh, I know your gods are just demons. You don't know the truth. Like absolute boldness. But at the same time, I'm going to love you no matter what. You could kill us all and we're still going to love you. And I find that everywhere in the 2nd, 3rd, and early 4th centuries. That's one thing that really stood out to me. The other was the story that Constantine wrecked everything. That, you know, when he came to power, he forced everyone to be Christian, and then suddenly Christianity was just an institution, is rubbish. Constantine, for all of his career, had a tolerance approach. Yes, he favored Christianity very much, but he had some really important Christians in his ear, like Lactantius, one of the greatest Christian thinkers at the early 4th century, who was in Constantine's ear saying, no, you will turn people off Jesus if you force them to worship Jesus. Christianity must be a thing of the heart. And Constantine adopted that policy, not just when he first became Western emperor in the Edict of Milan in 313, but also when he became sole emperor in 326 and could have imposed religion as he saw. But he actually wrote to the provinces saying, there's no way I'm going to do that because I don't want to turn you off Jesus. So we've got to wait 70 years before Christianity really begins to impose itself and sideline pagans and outlaw worship in the temples. So the myth of Constantine has fallen apart as I've prosecuted those sources. And I'll give you one more, if that's okay.
Yes,
sure. That's great.
One more. I didn't know anything about this before starting to crawl through the so-called Dark Ages. There never was a Dark Ages, by the way. But, you know, that classic idea that come the year 500, Rome in the West has collapsed and it's all darkness and plagues and ignorance. And yeah, okay, sure. But as I crawled through those centuries, I came across a name I'm ashamed I'd never heard of, Eligius. He was the greatest jewelry maker in Europe in the early 600s. And he had some kind of spiritual experience which led him to believe that he should be using his vast wealth as the person who made the gold crowns for kings. He should use his vast wealth, not just for the poor, but to go around France, wherever there were slaves being sold, buy them all with his money and set them free with a little bit of a travel money if they just wanted to go back up into Saxony or down into Spain or back over to England. Now, he did this for 20 years to the point where there was this period in the mid-7th century where you could not have owned a slave if you were in the orbit of this man. Eventually, he became a bishop, you know, the head of the churches, and he didn't even allow royalty to hold slaves. How did I not know about this? And what is remarkable to me about someone like Eligius is he was a red-hot evangelist as well. He's not just what, you know, we sometimes dismiss now as a social justice warrior, you know, just looking after the poor and freeing slaves. He was preaching to pagan areas in the northwest of France, up toward the scary Frisians, right, who hadn't yet been converted. And from the sources that we have, we know that he converted many of them to Christ and then taught them the gospel life. That, you know, if you've been so loved by God, you're to love everyone else. That was a special gift to come across Bishop Eligius.
That's good. Yeah, it was so funny. A couple of the things I wanted to ask you about in the interview, as I was thinking through the topics I wanted to hit on, were Constantine and the Dark Ages. And so you hit on two of those. So that's great, because I was so appreciative of how you brought out the truth of what happened with Constantine and also what happened at the Council of Nicaea. I found both of those things to be very helpful. I was wondering, though, when you're talking about some of these things that Christians often are very shy about talking about, as far as the, you know, whether it be the Inquisition or the Crusades or some of these things, what would you say to a Christian who would challenge you that, you know, John, you're kind of airing our dirty laundry here. You know, you're making us look bad. We don't want to put a stumbling block in front of people. Yeah. Of course, that's not my view, but what would you say to somebody who would maybe challenge you in that way?
Well, I got a long list of names of friends and colleagues who have said exactly that. Look, my reply is the one that I brought up at the very beginning. It's Jesus who said, "Take the log out of your eye, Christian, and then you'll be able to see clearly." So I think of my project as, you know, searching for the logs in our eye and being open about them. You know, we of all people in the world should be quick to admit fault because we don't believe we're good through and through. That's the kind of secular myth, you know, good through and through and only getting better. Christians have never bought that. Christians believe even the best of us have feet of clay, and it is just right to admit fault where the fault is there. Now, I should qualify that by saying sometimes these friends and colleagues who say that have confused me with the other sorts of Christian that I've mentioned at the start who only criticize the church, who are trying to get brownie points. Do you use the expression brownie points?
We do.
I'm not sure. Okay.
We do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Get brownie points from the media for criticizing the church. Well, I'm not in that camp either, because a big part of my book is saying, look what Eligius did. You know, the first abolitionist was not William Wilberforce or those beautiful Quakers. It was Eligius. In fact, before that, Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century was an abolitionist. The whole notion of free education for all came to us via Alcuin of York in the 8th century, right? The notion of free healthcare. Now, I know that's controversial in America, so maybe I should go carefully. But the fact is, no one had thought to open hospitals for everyone free of charge until Basil the Great had his idea in about 360 AD, where he used the best of Greek medicine. He himself had some training in Greek medicine. He'd gone to the Great Academy of Athens, and he opened this massive complex, which had a leprosarium for those with leprosy, right through to aged care, a place that looked after infants that had been collected from the streets, but also a hospital proper, where he employed doctors and nurses to look after them. Now, once he did that, about 20 years later, you've got your second hospital down in Rome, started by Fabiola, one of the wealthiest women of Rome, done it as a Christian. She's deliberately, they all thought they were doing sort of the Good Samaritan, you know, putting oil on the sick and so on. And within a few hundred years, you've got literally hundreds of hospitals, all of them run by the church. It was just seen as a normal thing. When you established a church and a diocese, you would make sure you had a healthcare center and it was available for all. Now, that came into our culture because of Christianity. Now, we can debate the best way to fund it nowadays. I don't want to tread on anyone's toes and sound like a communist. I'm just saying that I'm not one of those Christians who is shy about the beautiful things Christianity has given our world, for which we should be very grateful.
Yeah, and that speaks to some of the balance I was talking about earlier in the book. I think it's a both and. We've got to own the mistakes, but at the same time, let's not emphasize the mistakes so much that we're also forgetting much of the good that's been done.
I think that's right.
I want to swing back around and talk about the Dark Ages again, or the so-called Dark Ages.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, I want you to go a little bit deeper on that. What do you mean by, what do people commonly think of the Dark Ages? What's the sort of myth? And then what's closer to reality, if you could unpack that?
The myth is Mother Church became so powerful and sidelined all the beautiful Greek and Roman learning that had been built up over the centuries. And the church turned its back on learning and just became an ignorant, power-hungry monster until the Renaissance. And only in the Renaissance, where there was this resurrection of Greek and Roman learning in the early 1300s, that's when we can say goodbye to the Dark Ages. So it's dark from, say, 500 to, let's say, 1300, 1400, somewhere around there. So that's the myth, and it is a myth. It completely misconstrues many things. One of them is how powerful the church was. The church in the East, the so-called Byzantine Empire, was powerful in the 5th and 6th centuries. That's true. But the church in Europe, in the West, was not powerful. It was subject to, once the Romans fell, once there was disorder in Europe because the Romans were beaten by the Goths, it was quite disorderly, and different warrior tribes fought, and the church wasn't running things at all. It, for centuries, was just trying to modify the violence. Sometimes they went along with the violence, but they were still setting up churches and monasteries and hospitals and doing their best in a very fractured Europe. But by the time you get to the 8th century and you have Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who sort of unifies Europe, I think that's when you can begin to talk about Christendom. Like Christianity having power. Okay. Before that, Christianity wasn't running the show. But in Charlemagne, let's put a pin in it. Let's say 770. In 770, I think we can say you've got the beginnings of Christendom. And what was the first thing they did? They educated Europe. Charlemagne employed the smartest man in the world. I mean, that's literally what one of the sources says. The smartest man in the world, a guy called Alcuin of York, a Pom from York, and got him to leave York and come and set up an educational system and lift Europe out of this kind of fractured environment to start learning once again all of the liberal arts. So you could barely say there was a Dark Ages as a result of the collapse of the Roman Empire. But the only thing bringing social cohesion and charity in that period was the church. And as soon as the church had enough power to really run things, they instituted schools. And by the end of Alcuin's life, there were hundreds of schools for boys and girls, rich and poor. And so people talk about, from the year 800 on, the Carolingian Renaissance. We normally think of the Italian Renaissance from 1300, the great Italian scholar Petrarch and so on. But too few people have heard of the Carolingian Renaissance. That is, the Renaissance started by Charles the Great, Charlemagne, where he gifted back to Europe this notion of education that studied arithmetic, rhetoric, grammar, astronomy. And then once you'd passed the 7 basic liberal arts and you were good, you could go through and learn natural history, what we call science now, philosophy, law, and theology. And this is what gave us the first cathedral schools, which of course became the first universities in Bologna and in Oxford and Cambridge. I guess what I'm saying is, if there was a Dark Ages, it was only because Rome was destroyed by the Goths and the church saved Europe from the Dark Ages. It certainly isn't responsible for it.
Yeah, I hesitate to say this because I'm always afraid it's going to downplay other parts of the book, but I personally could say to listeners that the bit on the Dark Ages in your book, for me, if nothing else, would make it worth buying. That's how eye-opening it was for me. I mean, there were a lot of ahas throughout the book, but that was one part in particular that I found especially eye-opening. You had mentioned that the 3 surprises were Constantine, and then of course the Dark Ages. I know there were more than 3, you said. But then you also said you were surprised by the confidence of the early Christians. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that speaks to that is in the book, you refer to the early Christians as good losers. Particularly, we're talking about the period from AD 64 to 312. And you say through this losing, the message of Christ's death and resurrection spread. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by them being good losers? Can you expound on that a little bit?
What I mean is, when they were mistreated, they didn't say things like, "Oh, how dare you? We have our rights." They said, "Oh yeah, we expected this. This is what they did to the Lord." And you know what happened next?
Yeah.
So kill us all you like. We're the death and resurrection people. That was the mentality.
Yeah.
And it isn't just historical speculation to say that this mentality, this good loser mentality, led to the growth of Christianity, because we actually have sources that say this. Two very important ones. Tertullian, who makes clear that persecution only promotes Christianity. He almost dares Scapula, the governor, to keep persecuting, because you know that every time you kill us, 1,000 more of us pop up. Wow. And the other is, I mentioned him earlier, Lactantius, who himself was a professor of rhetoric at the school of Nicomedia when the great persecution broke out in 303. In 303, there was this devastating persecution. The Roman Empire was trying to wipe out Christianity once for all. And its first policy was to sack all Christian academics who had made their way up into the academies. And Lactantius was one of them. But he wrote a book while in hiding, and throughout it is this incredible confidence, this willingness only to love, to turn the other cheek, to bless those who curse, all the sort of stuff we associate with Jesus. But he actually makes the point that our losses, what seem losses, are actually victories. Because every time a Christian dies well for Jesus, 100 onlookers think, I wonder if there's something to that. And like Tancha says, this is why the more you kill us, the more we grow. It's such a contrast with an attitude you often hear today that to my mind comes from too many years of being in charge, that says, when a CNN host criticizes Christians, we're outraged and, we'll say, how dare he, we have religious rights just like anyone, which might be true, but it's the outrage of it that I don't see in early Christianity. Early Christianity just knew they were from another place, knew that no matter what you did to them, we're the death and resurrection people. So we've won and our Lord has already won. So come and, smack us around the head. We're only going to smile sweetly back and keep telling you the truth. That spirit is everywhere in the early sources, and I find it inspiring.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I wanted to thank you because that part that you just expressed there challenged me in my own discipleship. On page 52 or my own walk with Christ, on page 52, you wrote this. You said, their role, meaning the early Christians, was simply to remain true to the way of Christ, seeking to transform the world through prayer, service, persuasion, and suffering. And I couldn't help when I read that to think to myself, is that what my life looks like? And so I really, really appreciated that.
Well, I appreciate you saying it. I mean, I felt the same when I come across the sources.
Yeah.
I feel so challenged by those early centuries. And I have to make clear that in talking about losing well, I don't mean you go out of your way to try and lose. That they were trying to persuade anyone. They would jump into any debate. Yeah. And they weren't shy about the hot topics. But it's just that when they were smacked across the head, they just smiled sweetly back and said, bless you in Jesus' name. That was the vibe. It's, as I say, it really inspiring to me, and I'm glad, it had the same effect.
It did.
Yeah. Great stuff. We're starting to run low on time, so I'm thinking maybe we'll wrap up with this final question. And the reason I want this to be one of the final questions is maybe someone's not going to go read the book. Shame on them. And so I think in my mind, one of the most, iconic things, you hear it all the time, like, oh, Galileo, he wanted to be scientific, but the nasty church just suppressed scientific advancement. And so clear that up, because if anybody's going to take anything away from this episode, maybe correct the most common.
Straighten that out.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of research into Galileo, and the bottom line is, in the best history of science volumes you get today, they will criticize using Galileo as a parable, which is how it's been used, as a parable of what the church always did to persecute knowledge. For one thing, Galileo himself firmly confessed belief in the creator God and in Jesus Christ, and his best buddies were churchmen. And so there's no way it was a church against science thing. The church was the biggest supporter of science. No one supported science more than the church. And the evidence for this is just overwhelming. Which is not to say the church wasn't an idiot in the trial with Galileo. Galileo had publicly slandered the current pope in his work, made him out to be a complete dunce. Well, that was politically a very stupid thing, and probably partly explains the politics of it all, as does the fact that there was a whole bunch of scientists, equally skilled scientists, advising the church that Galileo was wrong. So it wasn't just, our Bible says something, therefore Galileo is wrong. It was actually a scientific discussion as well, which the church got absolutely wrong in the end. Okay, great. But it wasn't that they were just going Bible versus science. And he wasn't tortured. He wasn't executed. He was put up in a villa, very flash villa, with one of his church prelates for a while. And then he was allowed to go to his own home. I'm not minimizing that it was censorship on the part of the church, and the church, has egg on its face as a result. But the myth that this is an example of science versus Christianity, just doesn't wash in the biggest scientific, historical volumes about the origins of science.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of how you go about in the book. Hey, no, wait, let's correct this. It's not all or nothing on one way or the other. Here's all the little nuances, and I really appreciate that. So it's sort of undeceiving the listeners. Speaking of that, can you talk a bit about your podcast? And you have a website called On Deceptions. Where might people find there, and what's the goal behind that?
Well, Undeceptions is a word C.S. Lewis used to use all the time. In fact, there's an out-of-print collection of his essays called Undeceptions. And because it's out of print, I pinched it, and now I own Undeceptions.
All right.
And it's basically, it's a good 16th century word. It means to reveal the truth. To undeceive is to reveal the truth. It's the opposite of to deceive. And that's what the podcast is trying to do. We interview major scholars in all the disciplines, ethics, philosophy, history, science, etc. And we take difficult questions and we unpack it. And we do it in a way that's not interview. We turn it into a kind of audio documentary. Yeah. So it's soundscape, it's clips from CNN and BBC, it's actors reading historical sources, and then the talking heads as well.
Mysterious footsteps.
That sort of thing. Yeah.
I just want to personally thank you for the book. I know it's one I'm going to be reading again and recommending to many people. So thank you so much for all of your work and time, and for your time today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address, or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Oughton and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.